Good evening and welcome to another Friday night edition of Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you doing?
Great as ever, Michael. Very, very happy to be joining my compadre, Michael
I think
Walker, for
uh,
a Friday night get together.
I think I saw you've been taking your young daughter to see some classical art.
Not just classical, but yeah, we went to the National Gallery because, in my view, it's the best free collection in London, and we didn't want to go to any exhibitions or any of that business, because obviously when you're with a young kid, you might have a tantrum after 2 minutes. So she was very good. We went for 3 hours into the permanent exhibitions of the National Gallery.
Coming up later tonight, another look at more of the individuals responsible for the recent riots across England. What can we say about them, given who's been sentenced so far? Also, Education Minister Jacqui Smith has said a funding crisis means some universities may have to close. She doesn't want them to close, but they may have to. Donald Trump decides to insult veterans. Right-wingers really have a problem with veterans at the moment. We're going to talk about how that came to pass. This was an unwelcome bit of news for the Labour Party today. Train drivers on the London to Edinburgh railway line have announced a fresh wave of weekend strikes. The walkouts are set to total 22 days between the end of August and mid-November. Nigel Roebuck, who has led ASLEF's negotiations with LNER, said this about the reasons for the strike. The dispute started nigh on 2 years ago with our members complaining about consistently being badgered for favours by managers outside of rostering agreements and being contacted remotely, which is also against our agreement. The bottom line is that LNER does not employ enough drivers to deliver the services it has promised passengers and the government it will run. The timing of the strike announcement is awkward for Labour as it comes just a couple of days after they agreed to a substantial pay rise for train drivers across the UK, which the government had hoped would end the strikes that have affected Britain's rail network for over 2 years. Now, ASLEF has said this dispute with managers at LNER is completely separate from their pay disputes. They're not going back on an agreement, and ASLEF will in fact be encouraging members of their union to vote to accept the new pay offer negotiated with the government. Now, that amounts to a 14% pay rise over a 3-year period. The Tories, though, have seen an opportunity to attack. Shadow Home Secretary James Cleverly said this: "The Labour government has been played by its union paymasters. This latest wave of strikes will be devastating for families who rely on train travel to see their loved ones. Offering a no-strings pay deal to militant strikers while stripping millions of pensioners of their winter fuel payment is nothing short of a national embarrassment." Now, that no strings reference there is because what the Tories were trying to do is they were trying to negotiate with the rail unions and saying, we'll give you, I think they said 4% over 4% one year, then 4% the next year, but you'd have to sign up to lower your labour rights. So Labour have said, we're going to separate those things. You can have this pay rise, and we're not going to change your terms and conditions, essentially. So that's the no strings reference there. Before ASLEF announced their strike on the London to Edinburgh line, which of course doesn't just go from London to Edinburgh, it stops by Newcastle and places like that. The right-wing press had already begun rounding on Labour over the deals. They've been striking with public sector workers. So this was the Daily Telegraph this morning. GPs next in line for PM's cash handouts. You can see that phrasing, a cash handout. These are not just the kind of pay rises that people would usually expect. Obviously, an 11% pay rise is a lot, but this is after a decade of pay freezes, essentially, and it is normal that people's pay should go up, not down. It has gone down for quite a while now. The Times have gone with ministers favouring unions over pensioners. Now, of course, that is a reference to the Labour Party having made the winter fuel payment, which used to go to all pensioners, now means tested, so it will only go to pensioners who are on some form of state benefit. Aaron, it is important to note these two disputes are separate. So there's this ASLEF pay deal, which they're encouraging their members to vote for. But the fact that you've got another ASLEF strike announced on the day when people are already having a go at Labour for being soft on the unions, it's awkward timing, isn't it?
Well, look, it's not ideal, but at the same time, I think if you're gonna have grievances, now's the time to get them out of the way. I mean, you don't want this to drag on with Labour, and so look, with regards to pay restraint, many different sectors have had to endure that for 14 years. Rail drivers, particularly since COVID, basically just seen flat pay. Obviously, in real terms, it had fallen quite significantly in terms of what it could buy because, of course, you have inflation. So that was always something that they wanted to address, as other sectors have done, will continue to do. Teachers, nurses, junior doctors. This is slightly different. What's interesting, though, is LNER is publicly owned. It's not some, it's an interesting one. You can't say it's private greed, corporate fat cats. It's publicly owned. It's administered effectively by Network Rail. I think fundamentally we're going to have a massive rethink about the rail network in this country. I think we need public ownership of rolling stock. I think actually Labour should be far more ambitious in terms of what they're doing. So look, if this keeps that in the conversation, if we continue to talk about the kind of rail network we need in this country, by the way, that includes HS2 going to Manchester, then I don't see that as a negative thing. What Labour absolutely do not want is to be having industrial action in October, November, December, over Christmas. If there are strikes, if there is industrial action over Christmas, over New Year, as there was so memorably really in 22, 23, then they look like schmucks, for sure. But this is early days. This is a legitimate grievance. That's what ASLEF are there for, to look after their members. I don't think it's really the end of the world. And I think that James Cleverly line really sums it up. Yes, rail drivers should be getting a pay rise. There's no issue with that. And you're the ones that say there's no money left. So Labour went for a grab, which they view as hitting wealthier or comparatively wealthier pensioners rather than anyone else. I mean, I thought the Tories liked means testing. So look, this is the Tories grasping. And you have to remember as well, of course, there's a subtext here, which is a Tory leadership race. James Cleverly is a candidate in that. So you're going to hear all sorts of crap from the Conservative front bench, even more than usual.
The angle of this I really don't buy is the union paymasters. Like, I don't think Labour are making these deals because they've, there's some sort of corruption going on with the trade unions who do give them lots of money, yes, but I think it's much more that they really want to get Britain growing, and they really, I think they think that if they've just got into power and then we have another wave of strikes as big as under the Conservatives, that's going to cause a huge dent to their popularity, and so it makes sense to get up front, get ahead of this, and say we're going to give you those pay rises which you've been denied over many years, and hopefully that will generate some goodwill. Right, the argument from the Tories is, once you give the trade unions one thing, they'll just keep asking until the country is completely bankrupted. That seems like it's getting a little bit ahead of itself. To me, I can see why you'd want to enter government and say, let's make these deals. Let's sort of start afresh. Apparently, Thatcher actually did that as well. Apparently, she gave a bunch of people a 25% pay rise when she was first elected in 1979. Of course, I'm not hoping that Labour relations go in a similar direction as they did under Thatcher, under Keir Starmer. I would be very surprised if they did. Who were the rioters that terrorised Britain in the worst wave of far-right unrest in almost a century? Now, that's a question which a number of reports based on the identities of people being rushed through the courts have sought to answer this week. And The Times has a very interesting article. It's based on the social media profiles of defendants, as well as conversations with their families. Now, among the rioters they investigate is 26-year-old Dylan Carey, who a judge said was an active and persistent participant in the Southport riot. Now, 3 days before the riot, Carey had been photographed at the Tommy Robinson demonstration in Trafalgar Square. Tommy Robinson, of course, would go on to tell his million followers on X that police were gaslighting the public about the Southport killer, i.e. not telling them something, hiding something, really helping to incite those riots. Casey, for some background, he's a father of one, and he attended the Tommy Robinson demo with his own father. So of the father, the Times write this: Carey's father is a regular poster on Facebook of conspiracy theories such as two-tier policing, an idea heavily promoted by Robinson. He has shared beliefs in the anti-vax movement and fears globalist elites are seeking the Great Reset. He also shared false claims that the Southport attacker was an immigrant. So sort of like father, like son in that situation, it seems. The Times also profiled another rioter named Tracy Pearson, aged 53. Pearson was also a fan of Robinson. And she and her wife, Michelle Gibson, were described as agitators outside a migrant hotel in Manchester on July the 31st. And the Times write this: Pearson, who is vegan and a regular at Pride events, wore an England flag around her waist while shouting at police, "They can get away with everything. They stabbed a soldier last week. Mental health. We ain't effing stupid. They rape our kids and murder them. Now, of course, once upon a time, we'd be very surprised, I think, to hear of a lesbian couple on a far-right demonstration. But I don't think they're the only sort of gay couple that have gone through the courts, because there was that gay couple who went and rioted after going to the bingo, wasn't there? So an interesting sort of intersection going on there. Another man convicted was 26-year-old Tyler Kay. Kay is a father of 3 from Northampton and was jailed for 38 months for using X to encourage people to, quote, set fire to all the effing hotels full of the bastards. The Times reports that Kay's online activity took a radical turn months into the pandemic in 2020 and during the Black Lives Matter protests. So they say this about him. A week before the Southport attack, he commented, "Amen to this," on a clip of Richard Tice, Reform's deputy leader, describing footage of a police officer kicking an Asian man in the head at Manchester Airport as reassuring. Kay also wrote that anyone rioting should be deported when Tice criticised police for failing to prevent unrest by a Romani family in Hare Hills, Leeds. The Manchester Airport attack and perceived soft policing in Leeds have been seen as key events before the Southport riots. Kay, who grew up in care, had wanted to be a police officer. Neighbours described him as entitled, a narcissist, and someone who knew how to play the system. So that idea that anyone rioting should be deported. Of course, this guy actually, I don't think, was convicted for rioting, but for inciting riots. He said stuff that was very clearly inciting riots. Interesting also that this was a guy who grew up in care. We've talked about at least one other person who was sentenced for rioting who grew up in that situation. These are obviously just a few examples. It will require, of course, a much more systematic study after many more people are sentenced to get a true idea of what made rioters tick. But after looking at the first 40 people sentenced so far, criminologist Simon Cotty has already suggested a taxonomy for describing or understanding participants. His article is in Unheard. It's titled "Meet the Three Types of Rioters." And he's named the 3 types: combatants, geezers and scallies, and losers. Now, he describes combatants as inveterate racists alongside self-proclaimed patriots motivated by fears about white replacement and hostility to the British state and police for their perceived collusion in this. Combatants are almost exclusively men who see themselves as defenders not only of English culture, but as the protectors of English women and girls from, in their eyes, the rapacious sexual desires of non-white and especially Muslim immigrant men. Tommy Robinson stuff, essentially. About the geezers and scally group, he says the following: older and younger men, respectively, with criminal backgrounds whose participation in the riots was motivated not by any considered ideological grievances, but an abiding interest in manufacturing mayhem and the drama of violent contention. Historically, riots have always attracted this kind of dissolute stress seeker because they present ripe opportunities for a tremendous tear-up, including hand-to-hand combat with reviled authorities and the ritualized looting of goods that are later invariably discarded or destroyed. So these are the guys he's saying. They're not particularly ideologically motivated, but are likely to have long criminal records. Basically, when they see trouble, they're more likely to run towards it as opposed to away from it. We've seen a few people with very long criminal records, and we've discussed those on this show. Finally, his final category, his third category, is losers. So of losers, or what he calls losers, he says this: losers refers to that type of rioter, both male and female, whose participation in the riots was spontaneous and situational. Many of these accidental rioters were drunk when they entered the fray, either because they're alcoholics or had been out on a bender or both. One 30-year-old rioter who hurled metal sheeting at police in Hartlepool had reportedly drank 30 cans of lager and had no memory of his involvement in the disorder. The author says a dozen or so of those already sentenced fit into his loser category. Aaron, what do you make of this taxonomy? Is it too early to say if this is accurate? Do you think it's a bit, I suppose it is a bit pejorative, but these are far-right rioters. What do you think?
Well, I think if somebody's drinking 30 cans of lager, you could describe them using a number of terms, couldn't you? One thing I would say is that some people obviously seek to call this political. It's protest. That's what people who are effectively apologists for these race riots, that's what they would say. These are protests. Yes, some people have done some bad things, but they're protests. It's legitimate. The grievances are legitimate. Many people aren't involved with any of the bad stuff you're saying. On the other side, you've got people saying this is purely criminal. It's purely wanton criminality. It's not remotely political. Like, this is just, it's just unhinged violence, and it's people just wanting to inflict unhinged violence. And of course, the truth is often somewhere in the middle. And there's a great category in social and political sciences to describe these kinds of events. It's the term contentious politics. You know, protest doesn't just manifest itself in people going on a demonstration from A to B holding placards. You can have riots, you can have insurrections, all the way up through to civil war, political assassination. And scholars of contentious politics look at these things as being on a spectrum, and they can, of course, be political. A bread riot is political, even if the participants just want to get some bread and something to eat. Clearly, the variables which have catalyzed that historically would be described as political variables, often inequality, access to resources, forms of prejudice, etc. So this is contentious politics. And the point with contentious politics is that the people involved are incredibly heterogeneous. They are not all ideologically motivated. They don't all want the same thing. They don't all agree on the same tactics. There are people who are in the wrong place, wrong time, who are wrong-uns. There are opportunists. There are people who get caught up in something they very quickly regret. And of course, there are highly ideological, very motivated people trying to drive events in a certain direction they view as politically advantageous. So this term of contentious politics, I think, is very useful. Often the sort of liberal default when examining this stuff is to say it's not political, it's just criminality. I just don't think that's helpful, because realistically, people who disagree with you won't take you very seriously, because they know that some people involved in these things are indeed very political, and they view the issues as very political. So I agree with the kind of taxonomy to an extent, and I think it underscores the point I made a moment ago, that the people participating in these will be very heterogeneous. It is not like an anti-war demonstration of 1 million people who agree on what you're doing. They agree on the protest. They agree on what you're trying to do, i.e. influence democratically elected decision makers. And they have a shared grievance, which is to stop, for instance, in 2003, the invasion of Iraq. Things like we've seen earlier this month with regards to these race riots, very, very different, far more complex. Of course, that doesn't mean you don't throw the book at people who've broken the law, but in trying to make political sense of them, often much more difficult than simply analysing a protest.
Do you think it's embarrassing for reform? And, Richard Tice was mentioned there, that, some of these people are being influenced clearly by Tommy Robinson, who sort of everyone accepts is sort of outside of the mainstream. But a lot of these guys seem to have been influenced by reform politicians as well. I mean, there's one argument that you can't judge someone by their followers. But there's another argument that, it's not an accident that these kind of people are very persuaded by Richard Tice and then going out and doing these things. I mean, from that passage, it seemed like Richard Tice had said that the police officer kicking that man in the head was reassuring, which is a despicable thing to say. So what's the relevance of things like reform politicians coming up in these articles?
Yeah, what Tice said in response to Manchester was just disgusting. And that, of course, was before we saw other footage emerge with regards to the alleged breaking of a nose of a police officer, etc. You could say there was more to it. At that point, we hadn't seen that. But in any case, what we had seen was a police officer clearly not engaging in a reasonable use of force, entirely unreasonable use of force, the incapacitation of somebody using a taser and then really literally kicking their head in. The idea that an elected member of parliament would be actually cheering that on is quite extraordinary, because what that police officer did, by the code of conduct which the police have to abide by, I think he's almost certainly transgressed it. So it is frankly quite alarming that an MP would do that. And that's very different to saying, look, we haven't seen the whole context, we haven't seen the whole video. You might not like that kind of talk, but it's very different from what Richard Tice did. And I think reform, I've said this before, Michael, I think reform have a real challenge ahead of them. Nigel Farage's approval ratings with Conservative Party votes in the last general election went down 17 points over the course of these riots in the immediate aftermath, because if you want to replace the Conservative Party, you are going to have to become the party of law and order. Conservative votes in 2019, 2024, who reform want to win over for 2028, 2029, you have to be saying things like, yes, of course, we want to reduce immigration. We want better law and order. We want cleaner streets. We want all the things these voters care about. You can't just jettison, though, the idea that you are civilized, competent people. That's the trick, of course. You have to show a little bit, if you're on that side of politics, you have to show a little bit of leg to extremists, which of course they are. Um, but you also have to play a little bit of a respectability game. Boris Johnson was often very good at that. Clearly, Reform haven't worked that one out yet. Look, right now they've got 5 MPs, they've got 4 million votes. If they want to replace the Tories, this will not work for them. Okay, they might pick up more MPs. They might even get a couple of dozen MPs, but in the long term, it's not going to work for them. You have to have an element of respectability if you're trying to literally be a party of government. But I think, Michael, to be quite honest, I don't think they want to be a party of government. I heard Nigel Farage the other day on, I think it was the radio or maybe on one of his social media channels. He said, everybody disagreed with me about X, but of course, everywhere I go, people disagree with me. And I thought, this doesn't sound to me like Geert Wilders or Marine Le Pen. It doesn't sound to me like he's actually comfortable with trying to build himself up as a credible national politician with a profile which can span beyond, previous Brexit and UKIP party voters. I don't think he's necessarily got into that mindset yet. He's quite old. Given that he's an MP for the first time, maybe that will never happen. I've always said that the people we need to keep an eye on in terms of reform, I think, are the next generation of activists, politicians, influencers. In Marine Le Pen's party, you have, of course, Le Pen, but you also have a younger man called Jordan Bardella. Who is going to be the Jordan Bardella of reform, picking up the baton and trying to spread and scale that movement and try and really subsume the Conservative Party vote? Because I don't think it's going to be Nigel Farage or Richard Tice.
British universities are facing a funding crunch. That's because since the increase in tuition fees in 2011, they have received a much larger proportion of their income from fees instead of government grants. And since then, the cap on fees has not really risen in line with inflation, or not really risen at all. In turn, that's led universities to rely on international students for extra cash. But now, with tighter immigration restrictions introduced under the Conservatives, that source of income could also be under threat. Education Minister Jacqui Smith was asked about the conundrum on Channel 4 News.
In actual fact, what we've seen today with the UCAS figures is for undergraduate students, there's about a flat level of overseas students. But I take your point that people may well have been put off coming to this country, not so much by policy changes, but by the sort of rhetoric that the last government used against them. Well, we're setting a different tone, and we think that will be heard across the world. You are welcome to come and study at the UK's world-class universities, alongside actually the increased number of UK 18-year-olds who are going into receiving their offers and going into university this year as well.
But, it's the postgraduate international students who have declined, and just sort of saying they're welcome might not be enough. They want to bring their family members with them. You're not going to overturn those restrictions. So is it really going to change?
Well, I think, we need to wait and see, because the postgraduate numbers for international students come later on down the track.
You're saying wait and see, but these universities are facing massive funding problems right now. Are you willing to see a university go bust? Because there are some institutions, you'll know where they are, that are at that point now.
Yes, if it were necessary, yes, that would have to be the situation. But I don't want that to be necessary. I want us to find a way for there to be financial stability for universities, and most importantly, for the students that they are serving into the future. And that is what we are working on.
So, Aaron, there, she was asked, is it okay for a university to go bust? She said, obviously, she doesn't want that to happen. But that, yes, these are independent institutions, independent organisations, and if they can't make themselves financially sustainable, then they're not necessarily, they can't rely on government support to stop them going bust. Did that answer surprise you?
Yes and no. You've had voices in the last week saying that cannot happen, it should not happen. You had a contract which was put out by the Office for Students. I talked about it on Tuesday's show, which is effectively looking for people who will have to come in and manage failing institutions. This is going to happen, by the way, in the new academic year. Try and turn them around. I think worst case scenario, yes, they'd go insolvent, they'd disappear. In Auger's words, though, this is the person I'm referring to. He wrote a report. He wrote a piece in the Financial Times earlier this week. Philip Auger, he said that shouldn't be happening. And look, why are universities failing right now? Why are so many struggling? We've got about 140 universities in the UK. 69 of those 140, so almost half, are presently engaging in restructuring or redundancies of departments, of individuals. 70 out of that 140 apparently running a deficit. So we have many, many universities in trouble. Look, you can run a deficit for a while and be fine. I'm not suggesting half of the universities are going to collapse, but we're looking, I think, at double figures and in serious, serious trouble. Why are they in serious trouble? Part of it is, yes, foreign students are less likely to come at the moment. Although I should say, she said a record number of 18-year-old students are enrolling. Actually, mature students have fallen, and mature students are more likely to go into nursing, which is terrifying when you think about the nursing shortages we have in this country right now. So the overseas students is one aspect, but there's a few others as well. One is the fact that basically the fake CEOs who've run universities in this country for the last 15 years, the fake CEOs, they tend to be average or underperforming academics who have really nowhere to go as academics. They pretended they worked for a FTSE 250 company for a few years. Many of those quote unquote leaders at British universities basically thought that cheap credit, low interest rates were going to be permanent. That's what they thought. That was just gravity. That was, the way the water goes down the sink. That's like the sun coming up. Cheap credit, it's a thing. It's going to last forever. It'll never change. Well, of course, it has changed. So that meant the cost of living crisis squeezed their margins, but also a lot of loans they take out or expectations they had for loans to take out to build infrastructure. They love building infrastructure. Actually, the costs of that have also massively increased. So that's another aspect as well. And basically, we've had very poorly managed universities for 15 years, much longer actually, but really fundamentally since the fee increase. And isn't it also remarkable, Michael? We have. She was on Good Morning Britain 10 minutes ago. And now she's saying that a higher education institution could just collapse, and nobody's voted for her. Very strange. On top of all of that, she said there, Jacqui Smith, that they're independent institutions if they can't pay their way as market actors, and so be it. Well, they're not market actors because we have a cap on domestic students in this country at £9,250. That was the arrangement. And I think if in 2010 the government had said, well, look, we're doing this, it's never going to go above £9,250. It was £9,000. So in real terms, universities are losing lots of money. By the way, I'd scrap fees, just to be clear, but that's where we are right now. We're going to put it to £9,000. It's going to be artificially put there. We're going to basically eliminate public funding from central government. Not altogether, but almost altogether. I think most universities would have said, actually, this is probably not such a smart way to do university funding. Initially, they liked it, because, of course, £9,000 in 2010 was a hell of a lot more. 2011, 2012 was a lot more than £9,250 today. They had the foreign students, they had the cheap credit. All three of those things have gone. So I don't think we need to be looking at closing universities or closing departments. I think that's a completely wrong choice here. Mickey Mouse studies. That's not the problem. That is not the problem. The problem is poor management, the end of low interest rates, falling foreign student numbers, and the fees architecture we've had post 2011, but obviously introduced in 2010. And here's the thing, Michael: that funding architecture was cheered on by the Liberal Democrats, the Labour right, and Universities UK, a bunch of plonkers. And as ever, the people on the streets, people like yourself or me, many of the people watching who protested against those increases were right. We were right. And at the time, the media was calling them and us violent, deranged, unhinged, uninformed, stupid, thick, you name it. Well, we were right. And the permanent political class was wrong. So I do worry if they were so wrong in 2010. And by the way, that had the tripling of fees had buy-in from across the political spectrum. It was an outgrowth of something called the Brown Report by Lord Brown, commissioned by Gordon Brown. And so Labour would have done the same thing, maybe slightly different, but broadly the same thing. And I think, look, if the political class has been so dumb on HE, higher education in this country, really since the introduction of tuition fees all the way back through to the late 1990s, why are things going to change now, right? The exact same people are at the wheel. Okay, Cameron and Clegg were a bit more insane than New Labour, but New Labour introduced these fees. Jacqui Smith's comrades in arms introduced these fees. I'm sure she voted for them as an MP. So I don't see how the people who created the problem can solve it. But realistically, I think we are going to see a decent number of universities face insolvency and collapse.
Strange, isn't it? Because obviously you can see why the universities liked the fees, because it meant that they got this big cash injection. Apparently one of the reasons why they prefer fees as opposed to, say, like a graduate tax is because they think it gives them a bit more independence from government, because the money goes straight to them. So, they don't want universities to end up cross-subsidizing different parts of, say, the education budget, for example. So they like that it goes straight to them. But to have done it at 9,000 then, if you've only increased it by £250 over 14 years or 12 years, now I'm not here saying they need to increase university tuition fees, but you can see there's an obvious problem there, which is going to cause them financial difficulties. Similar, actually, George Osborne did this with social housing. So one of the reasons why social housing is such a mess is he did this policy that sort of looked good on paper, which is he froze rents on social housing, but then that meant that councils had absolutely no money to do up their properties, and all it did was save central government money because they didn't have to pay out housing benefit, or the housing benefit they paid out was less. So this idea of sort of the government saying, we're going to protect you by not allowing prices to rise in these particular sectors, and then that sort of just completely destroys them from the inside. It seems to me sort of classic short-term thinking. So I think Labour are going to have to come out with a more comprehensive plan for how they're going to stop sort of the collapse of a sector, which I think lots of people have seen coming for a while. Earlier this week, the Home Secretary wrote in the Telegraph that Britain must restore trust in its police. But at least one police force hasn't made a good start. Yesterday, His Majesty's Inspectorate for the Police released their latest report into the efficiency, effectiveness and legitimacy of the Metropolitan Police, and it did not make for good reading. So I know this is a serious topic, but I love this chart because it's just so hilariously humiliating. So you've got these 5 categories: outstanding, empty; good, empty; adequate, police powers and treating the public fairly and respectfully. Fine, no, they're important. That's adequate, not quite good, not quite outstanding, but adequate. Then in the requires improvement category, preventing and deterring crime and antisocial behaviour and reducing vulnerability. Now, preventing and deterring crime, that's quite important. Responding to the public, that's quite important. Protecting vulnerable people, quite important. Building support and protecting the workforce, good, important. Leadership and force management, important. I think it's probably those preventing and deterring crime that people are going to care the most about. But then in inadequate, so where they're just not doing well at all, investigating crime, and then managing offenders and suspects. So really 2 of the most important functions of any police force, they're both in the inadequate category. Nothing in outstanding, nothing in good, inadequate, investigating crime, managing offenders and suspects. This is not the kind of report card you want to be given. So the report, of course, has some more details. So in reference to investigating crime, it says this: we found examples of complex crimes being allocated to officers with only basic investigative training. For example, a commercial robbery with multiple lines of inquiry was being investigated by an inexperienced officer with little supervision or guidance. We found inexperienced officers trying to manage large workloads beyond their training and knowledge. We even found crimes with obvious vulnerability, such as indecent images of children, extrafamilial child abuse, and sexual offences that were being investigated by new recruits. You're giving a really, really complicated, really, really serious investigation to someone who has just been hired. And that's one of the reasons why the Metropolitan Police has been found to be inadequate, the lowest category out of 5 when it comes to investigating crime. And when it comes to managing offenders and suspects, the report says this: in our inspection, we found evidence that too many visits to registered sex offenders are announced in advance. The force isn't meeting the standards laid out for visits in the College of Policing's authorised professional practice or its own policy. The APP states that visits to registered sex offenders should be unannounced, so they provide a true understanding of the risk the registered sex offender poses. If visits are announced, there is greater opportunity for the registered sex offender to conceal prohibited devices, such as phones and laptops, or items that might indicate that they are in breach of licence or the conditions of a sexual harm prevention order. Now, this sounds like quite basic stuff, doesn't it? They can't investigate crime. They can't manage people who've been found guilty of crime or who are offenders and suspects. A damning report. For more on what's going wrong at the Met, I'm joined now by Cassia Rowland, a senior researcher at the Institute for Government who focuses on criminal justice and policing. To set us off, Cassia, how unusual is it for a force to get a report quite this bad?
This is pretty unusually bad report, I would say. But I think it's important to flag that generally we've seen more forces, we think, going into what's sometimes called special measures that the Met has been in now for 2 years and is continuing to remain in after this inspection report. So it's unusual, but it's becoming more common.
What's the explanation for why it's becoming more common? Is this sort of another one of those stories where the Tories did austerity and then a public service stopped working very well?
Austerity is definitely part of the picture. So we saw police officer numbers fall really sharply in the early 2010s. And while those cuts have been reversed as a result of the Boris Johnson kind of 20,000 police officer recruitment program, those are very inexperienced officers who've now come into forces. So that tends to mean that they're less productive. They don't have as many experienced officers around them, kind of showing them the ropes. And they're therefore more likely to leave, which keeps the problem of inexperience and poor retention going. So there is a very obvious hangover from austerity there. There are also other factors that are making the crime mix more complicated to respond to. So more crimes that are reported to the police now are to do with sexual offences or domestic abuse. And we've got some new crimes in relation to domestic abuse, things like coercive control, that are quite challenging for the police to investigate effectively and put more pressure on them in terms of the level of demand, because you need to do more victim support and things like that for a domestic abuse case, for instance, than you do a kind of common assault case that might happen down the pub.
What's the timing that those things have sort of come in? Because I know that, obviously there's been big problems with the police for a while. You've sort of explained how austerity is involved in that. I think this report is worse than the one in 2022. So are those changes things that have come in very, very recently?
Whether it's worse than the one in 2022 is a bit tricky to say, because the inspectorate are very careful to say that they're not directly comparable. I think looking at the scale, I would say it's worse. The reasons for that are probably more to do with it being a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, or a kind of a downward spiral that I think the Met has got itself caught in that poor performance leads to lower trust, both in terms of failures to resolve crimes and investigate crimes properly, but also in terms of really terrible instances of misconduct and things like that. So that means people don't trust the police as much. They don't rely on them. They don't cooperate in the same way as they might have done. And that is really bad for the ability of the police to do their job, because they're so reliant on public support and engagement in order to police effectively, that when that starts to go, it's quite hard to pull it back.
What you hear from people, though, is it's not that they're not calling the police. It's that they call the police, their phone's been stolen. They know where it is. They can see it on Find My Phone where it is. And the police just say, sorry, we don't have capacity to deal with this. So it does seem to be that there is purely a capacity issue, which I know I don't know the statistics on this, but it seems like there's a public perception that this has got worse, and that it's got worse fairly recently.
I think that is right. I was talking to a former colleague earlier who was saying that he looked at 167 areas, very small local areas, where not a single neighbourhood crime has been solved in the last 3 years. So they've got 100% unsolved failure rate. Of those 167, 166 are in London. So there's clearly a very extreme problem with how the Met is dealing with these kinds of kind of theft from the person, robbery, criminal damage, your very sort of standard neighborhood crime types that they just aren't managing to get to grips with.
Is potentially one of the reasons. Obviously, there have been like huge scandals in the Met recently. I think none sort of more extreme than the Sarah Everard killing, where a Metropolitan Police officer kidnapped, raped, and murdered a young woman. Now, obviously, that led to some quite, very much warranted soul searching from the Met. We've had a report, the Casey review, incredibly critical of the Met. Is there an argument that sort of while the Met is looking at internal issues and sort of trying to stamp out abuse, they get distracted from solving crime, and there's a bit of a bandwidth issue here, which is when you're looking at internal structures, you take your eye off your other aim, which is actually to stop other people committing crime, not just your own police officers.
I think that's maybe quite a generous reading of it, actually, and that it's probably not accurate to say that it's because they're so focused on improving things internally. There is this big transformation program, a new Met for London, that is intended to address the failings identified in the Casey review. But one of the things that this inspection report shows is how little progress has been made on some of those issues. So they are working on them, they're kind of putting changes in place, but those aren't yet having a significant and consistent impact on how the Met is actually responding to crime or interacting with the public or dealing with misconduct or vetting issues.
Because of the riots, a big thing which has sort of come up is, are they being asked to police too much of social media, and that's getting distracted? Sort of whenever I go on sort of right-wing channels, the talking point is always they're spending too much money on diversity, equity and inclusion, and they're spending too much sort of police work looking at what people tweet. Is there anything to that?
I can't tell you how much police time is spent looking at online crime in that sense. I will say that neither can the Metropolitan Police Service tell you that, because we don't have a good estimate of how the police actually spending their time. I think it's much more fundamental, like basic management things like knowing who your workforce are, what kinds of training they all have, or how you can deploy people. Is that very basic management information is lacking, and that makes it very hard to run a force effectively.
Yvette Cooper said at the start of this week, obviously we've got a new Labour government, she's saying we need to rebuild trust in the police. Obviously, this report isn't going to do much to rebuild trust in the Metropolitan Police. I have to say, nothing you've said in this interview is rebuilding my trust in the Metropolitan Police. So I suppose from a sort of government policy perspective, this is presumably going to be one of the priorities of the Labour Party. What can they do? I mean, the description you've given, it all sounds a little bit hopeless. I can't see where's the strong bit of the Met that you can build on.
There's some reason for optimism in terms of they've got the right ideas, I think, in the new Met for London plan. It's the implementation of them that is the challenging part at the moment. So I think in terms of what the government can do, that's quite difficult, because a lot of these are operational decisions and kind of management decisions for chief constables and senior officers around the country. What we often find in our research is actually the importance of the kind of middle manager role, which is not a popular argument at all. But you see it in the police service that sergeants really set culture and standards for their teams. They are a really crucial role in terms of improving trust, making sure people are being treated fairly and with respect, and all of those things that are so important to a functioning police service. And I think it's maybe making sure that forces have the resources that they need to get those kind of first tier and second tier managers, your sergeants, your inspectors, to be, I guess, better skilled and better aware of what they can and should be doing in order to make sure that standards are applied across frontline officers.
Is there potentially a bit of a sort of death spiral here where, everyone's lost faith in the Met, sort of, or police forces around the country? As you say, that's sort of problematic in terms of getting cooperation from the public. Could also be quite damaging in terms of getting the right people to apply to join. Like, who at the moment wants to join this organization, right? It's been called institutionally racist, misogynist, institutionally kind of everything by Louise Casey. It can't solve crime. The left hate it, the right hate it. Who's joining the police? And is there a problem that not many people want to join it?
I think that is a real problem, and it's a problem for the Met in particular. So they actually had to relax some of the restrictions they had on where you had to come from or live to join the Met. So it used to be the case that you had to live in London, or at least a majority of officers had to live in London. It's now the case that a majority of Met officers don't live in London. So that's really difficult because it means that people aren't part of the communities that they're working in, and that they're not representative of the communities that they're working in. And the Met has tried quite hard, I think, to improve things like diversity across a range of measures, particularly ethnicity and gender, but has struggled to do that. It's still very male dominated, very white as an organization. And that does worsen these problems. It's absolutely the case that the more these scandals come up, the harder it is to get a more diverse recruitment pool. In terms of how you solve it, I think it's really challenging, but the place I would start is probably around that more kind of direct outreach in communities, trying to rebuild that trust on a very local level. I think that's really important.
Cassia Rowland, thank you so much for joining us. It's usually the left who are accused of not supporting our troops or being unpatriotic, but it's actually right-wingers who can't stop disrespecting veterans. In 2018, when Donald Trump missed a remembrance event in France, he was reported to have said, quote, "Why should I go to that cemetery? It's filled with losers." He was also reported to have called Americans who died in the war suckers for getting killed. Closer to home, you'll remember Rishi Sunak's lowest moment in his disastrous election campaign this year was when he came home early from an event celebrating D-Day veterans. He did that to pre-record a TV interview. Of course, the title of Master of Disrespect remains with Donald Trump, though, and he has taken another swipe at soldiers.
I have to say, Miriam, I watched Sheldon sitting so proud in the White House when we gave Miriam the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That's the highest award you can get as a civilian. It's the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, but civilian version. It's actually much better because everyone gets the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's soldiers. They're either in very bad shape because they've been hit so many times by bullets, or they're dead. She gets it, and she's a healthy, beautiful woman. And they're rated equal.
They're rated equal. He was talking there about Miriam Adelson. She's the wife of mega donor Sheldon Adelson, who Trump granted the Medal of Freedom in 2018, essentially just for giving him money, right? Just a very wealthy person who donates to his campaign. But he says that medal, the Medal of Honor is, or the Medal of Freedom is better than the Medal of Honor, because the Medal of Honor, that goes to veterans. And yeah, I mean, the prize is equal, but they're going to be either like really injured or dead. So it's better to get the one that's equal, but you can go up there and look gorgeous and amazing. Aaron, what's going on with conservatives and veterans at the moment? You know, they just keep insulting them.
Trump is a really strange guy, Michael. Like he keeps on, he does all the stuff that you just wouldn't expect a conservative to do. Of course, he tries to lean into being, tough on law and order. He loves the police. He's, the US military was never so good as it was under him, although he didn't use it. Of course, he would say in typical Trumpian fashion, we didn't have to use it. It was so good. Everyone was too scared. But then he does things like, this is, we saw it with John McCain as well, right? People saying he's a veteran. He won Purple Hearts. He was a POW in Vietnam. And Trump said, quite amusingly, to somebody who doesn't really care, because I'm not an American national, but obviously it's an outrageous thing to say. If he was so good and so smart, he wouldn't have got caught. It's like, can you imagine that rationale with POWs? If you had a British prime minister who was talking about, say, British prisoners of war held in awful conditions in East Asia during the Second World War, they were captured at Singapore, maybe. They were held in awful conditions, often in Southeast Asia, by the Japanese Imperial Army. Horrific conditions. Can you imagine a British Prime Minister saying, well, they're not really heroes, they got caught? Or, the fall of Singapore, when the Japanese Imperial Army, routs the Brits. It's the biggest ever surrender by the British Army, ever. Can you imagine a British Prime Minister or a British party leader say, they aren't heroes, they lost, I don't like losing? It's so impossible to translate that to a British context. Like, you'd be over, especially if you're a Conservative Party leader. You would be over, you'd be kaput. And I think actually, again, bringing it back to the UK, and one of the problems for Farage is he sometimes says and does like outrageous things because he thinks that translates a little bit better. It played okay, or maybe even well with Trump, so it'll play well here. Well, not necessarily. Trump does say some absolutely bizarre stuff, but the thing is, as we all know, he doesn't need to win the actual overall vote, the popular vote, in order to become the president. He needs to win the right votes in the right places. But this is why he didn't win the popular vote in 2016 or 2020, and it's why he won't win the popular vote in 2024.
We've got one more Trump moment for you from this week. This time he's talking about the dangers of Kamala Harris.
You're all going to be thrown into a communist system. It's a communist system. You're going to be thrown into a system where everybody gets health care. You wait for your doctor like 10 months, 12 months, 11 months. You got to see some of these plans, how they work in other countries. It's disgraceful. So private health care is gone. She wants it out.
You're going to be in a communist system. Everybody gets health care. Although, I mean, you do have to wait for a while for health care in this country, but no one is really gagging for the American model. That vision of communism, Aaron, I mean, the clip that went viral actually didn't have him talking about the queues. It just had him saying, you're going to live under communism, you're all going to get healthcare. And then obviously he went on to say, it will be free, but you'll have to wait for it, which kind of is, in a way, is a valid description of Britain at the moment, but it doesn't need to be what Britain is like.
I don't think people realize how bad US healthcare actually performs in terms of the measures that really matter. You look at life expectancy, for instance. Life expectancy in Cuba is better than the United States. Life expectancy in China is better than the United States. Life expectancy in Turkey is better than the United States. A woman in Bosnia, one of the poorest countries in Europe, is less likely to die giving birth than a woman in the United States. By far the world's largest economy, by nominal GDP. So, I mean, that is just absolutely extraordinary. And the idea that you would make a joke about access to free healthcare, given that, crazy. Before the events of last year, more or less, I believe, Michael, you can correct me if I'm wrong, more or less, the average man in Gaza had the same life expectancy as the average African American, I think, more or less. What I do know is that in the state of Kerala in India, median life expectancy has been higher than that of African American for a pretty long time. Talked about by Amartya Sen in a book he wrote, Development as Freedom. You know, when you have those kinds of statistics, you have very objectively poor countries doing much better than you. I think also China, right? It's really difficult to sell your system as superior when China's GDP per head is a sixth, a seventh of the US, and it's already giving better health outcomes in terms of people living longer. Crazy. And then, of course, some people who defend the US come back and say, no, on the measures that really matter, the US healthcare system's really good. What, like life expectancy? Okay, if that's what if communism means better life expectancy, I'll take it.
Really not defending the American healthcare system, which I think is not a good system. It's okay in Germany, it's okay in France, America's not. But I think probably the reason America has a very low life expectancy isn't so much to do with the healthcare, it's to do with the guns and the fentanyl. So presumably that is skewing that data somewhat. What do you think?
The guns, I don't know. Fentanyl, certainly, deaths of despair. But you can't say, hey, look, you know what? Don't criticize our healthcare system. The real reason why actually we're being outperformed by other countries is because of deaths of despair. I mean, that's also a public health crisis, right? The reason why so many people are hooked to fentanyl is because of the awful incentives built into the private healthcare model of the United States. You know, you had a PR and marketing effort by one particular pharmaceutical company basically incentivizing doctors to lie to patients about how addictive fentanyl was. Really extraordinary. Giving away cuddly toys of cute little fentanyl pills to children. That's what was happening. So I don't think that's a good defense of the US healthcare model, Michael. I know you're not saying that, but that's my rebuttal.
I 100% take your point on fentanyl. I would say that the guns thing is separate and does lower life expectancy, because the other thing when you think life expectancy is 75, that doesn't mean you're expected to die at 75. Most people will die at 80, but if enough people die at 25, then that lowers the level. So guns does really matter when it comes to the American life expectancy, but so does fentanyl. And I stand corrected. That is definitely not separate from the healthcare system, because the reason why everyone was able to get addicted to fentanyl in America, whereas it in Europe, is, as you say, because the incentives are completely warped in America. We have the NHS it's called NICE. I don't know what it stands for, but that's the organization which sort of, they get together and they say, is this the kind of drug that doctors should be giving out in Britain? It's based on sort of the evidence base, but also the price of it. That means they can sort of bargain with pharmaceutical companies to get the price down. And, fentanyl didn't get through. Whereas, as you say, in America, not only do you have adverts to the public, but you also have all of these salespeople going around to GP practices. I don't know what they call them there, but the doctors' practices, and telling people that this is the drug you've got to get your patients hooked on. So no, you're right, Aaron. Their healthcare system does have a lot to do with their lower life expectancy. Thank you for joining me this evening, Aaron. It's been a pleasure as always.
My pleasure, Michael. That is a really extraordinary story, fentanyl. You had something multiple times more addictive than opium, and doctors were saying it was as safe as having a chocolate bar. So yeah, the US on healthcare, very screwed up. I hope everybody enjoys their weekends.
I also hope you all enjoy your weekends. Thank you for watching. We'll be back, of course, on Monday. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.